Yuan stood on the corner of the street, a strange feeling tugging at the edges of his mind. It was not the first time he'd felt this way. In fact, it had become disturbingly frequent over the past century. His feet were planted firmly on the sidewalk, his cloak brushing the pavement with each step, but his mind was adrift, lost in a sea of fragmented thoughts. There was a woman sitting at a cafe across the street, laughing with a group of friends. Her laugh was bright, full of life, and for a moment, Yuan swore he remembered the sound. It was something he knew. Or at least, should have known. He didn't know her name, yet the soft curve of her lips and the way her eyes sparkled in the afternoon light felt familiar. But that wasn't all. There was something deeper, something about the way she looked at the world that made him ache. He had seen that expression before. He knew it. Or had he? He shook his head, frustrated. What is happening to me? He thought. Why can't I remember? The last 100 years had passed in a blur. He had lived for 1,000 years, seen empires rise and fall, watched the world transform in ways he could barely comprehend. He had been everywhere, at least, that's what he thought. But the longer he lived, the more his memories became indistinct, like pages in an old book that had been eaten away by time, the ink smeared beyond recognition. Yuan's fingers brushed against his chest where a pendant once hung, a pendant given to him by someone who had once been dear to him. The chain was missing. Gone. As though it had never been there. The ache in his chest deepened. What had happened to his past? He glanced around him, his eyes scanning the modern city. People walked by in a steady stream, oblivious to the stranger who had lived through their ancestors' stories. Their faces were filled with youth, with the vitality that Yuan had long lost but that still flickered inside him. They were, in a way, lucky. They had time. But time, his time, was running out, slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. He had lived 1,000 years, and yet, his earliest memories were fading, slipping away with the inevitability of nightfall. The worst part? He had no idea when it had started. There was no moment of clarity, just a gradual decline, a slow erosion of his past. Excuse me, are you all right? Yuan turned, startled by the voice. A young man had stopped beside him, concern in his eyes. I'm fine, Yuan said quickly, brushing off the stranger's worry. He wasn't fine, of course, but it was easier to lie than to explain the truth. How could anyone understand? How could they comprehend the crushing weight of losing yourself in the fog of time? The young man nodded but didn't move away. His eyes studied Yuan for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then, as if deciding not to press the issue, he smiled and continued walking. Yuan watched him for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the street, and that's when it hit him, the moment that would change everything. It wasn't the strangers he encountered, nor the fleeting moments of nostalgia. It was something deeper. My memories, Yuan realized. They were not just fading. They were being stolen. Someone or something was taking them away from him. His memories were vanishing, bit by bit, as if they were being traded for something else. 1,000 years of life, gone, and for what? The answer came to him suddenly, with the force of a tidal wave. The time merchants, the ones who had granted him this endless life, had taken more than just his years. They had taken his memories, piece by piece, in exchange for each extension of his life. Each century, they had bargained with him, pulling a little more of his past away, exchanging it for a few more decades of existence. The terms of their deal had been vague at first, but now the truth was clear. Yuan had been a fool, trading his soul for the illusion of immortality. But what now? What could he do to reclaim what was his? With the realization, a fire ignited in his chest. Yuan didn't want immortality anymore. He didn't want to live forever if it meant losing himself, losing who he was, who he had been. He had to find the time merchants. He had to confront them. He had to demand his memories back. The search for the time merchants wasn't easy. Yuan had seen their influence across the ages, but they were elusive, existing in the spaces between seconds, in the hidden places where time bent and stretched. They were not bound by the laws of the world that governed ordinary men. They were something more, something ancient, but Yuan was determined. The next few days were a blur of action and thought, as he sought out anyone who might know of the time merchants. There were whispers in the underworld, cryptic references in forgotten texts, and the occasional stray mention in the deepest corners of the library of time. But no one could give him an answer. He didn't know where to turn next, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Time was not on his side. With each passing day, his memories, his identity, slipped further away. It was then, on the fourth day of his search, that he met her, Lian. She was a strange one, a wanderer like him, someone who seemed to drift through the world without being tied to any one place or time. She appeared on the street corner where Yuan had been standing, looking as though she had materialized out of nowhere. Her eyes were sharp, her hair a tangled mess of dark curls. There was something in her gaze that suggested she knew more than she let on. Something ancient, hidden beneath the surface. She walked up to him, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "You're looking for them, aren't you?" she asked, as if she had read his thoughts. Yuan blinked, taken aback. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows more about the time merchants than you do," she said, crossing her arms as she studied him. Yuan's heart skipped a beat. How did she know? "I'm not interested in making friends," he replied curtly. "I need information." "Funny," Lian said, cocking her head to the side. "I was thinking the same thing." And just like that, they were off. Lian led him through alleyways, into hidden courtyards, and across rooftops that overlooked a world full of secrets. She spoke cryptically about the time merchants, hinting at their origins and their strange power over time. They were older than the world itself, she said, and their influence stretched back to the very beginning of the universe. "Time is not a thing you can simply barter with," Lian warned him, her voice dropping low. "The more you trade, the more of yourself you lose. You'll never get it back, Yuan." Her words struck a chord with him. He knew the dangers. He knew that facing the time merchants could be a death sentence, not in the traditional sense, but in a much worse way. He could lose himself entirely, but there was no turning back now. They continued their journey together, through city after city, searching for the elusive place where the time merchants resided. All the while, Yuan's mind was consumed with thoughts of the life he had lived, the memories that were slipping through his fingers. And then, just when he thought he couldn't go on, Lian gave him a strange riddle. "In the place where the clock ticks backward," she said, "you will find what you're looking for." Yuan furrowed his brow, puzzled. "What does that mean?" "I can't explain it to you," she said with a grin. "You'll know when you get there." The first part of Yuan's quest was behind him. He had discovered the truth, met the mysterious Lian, and now he was closer to the time merchants than ever before. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the choices that lay before him would change everything. But Yuan had made his decision. He was going to reclaim his memories, no matter the cost. Yuan's footsteps echoed through the narrow alleyways of the forgotten city, the weight of the search pressing against his chest. Lian walked ahead of him, her strides purposeful, as if she knew the path they were meant to take. Yuan's mind was still on the riddle she had given him, the phrase, "where the clock ticks backward," spinning in his head like an unresolved melody. It didn't make sense to him. Nothing in this city made sense. The place felt ancient, yet there was something strangely modern about it, as if time itself were folding in on itself. He couldn't help but feel the sensation of eyes watching him from every corner, from every shadow. It was a city that breathed in ways it should not, its corners curling inward like a clock winding backwards. Just as Lian had said. "We're getting close," Lian said, her voice low but steady, as if she were speaking to herself more than to him. She glanced over her shoulder. "Keep your wits about you. Time isn't a friend here." "Not anymore." Yuan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant. Time had been slipping from him for so long now that it felt like an old acquaintance, one who had overstayed its welcome. But the urgency in Lian's tone made him uneasy. Time had always been his companion, his master, and now it was his adversary. Every step he took toward the time merchants was another step into the unknown. They turned a corner and found themselves standing before an unassuming door, tucked between two crumbling buildings, as if it had been forgotten by the world. There were no signs, no markings, just the door. It felt out of place in this city, like a relic from another time, a place where the clock had, indeed, begun to tick backward. Lien approached the door and placed her hand on the handle. She hesitated for a moment, then looked at Yuan with a knowing expression. This is it. You won't find what you're looking for unless you're willing to give everything. Your memories, your time. It'll all be on the table. Yuan didn't hesitate. The memories he had already lost were more than enough. What else could he give that hadn't already been taken from him? He had lived 1,000 years, but that was nothing if he didn't know who he had been. Without those memories, he was a ghost. 1,000 years of life, and yet, he had no sense of self beyond the passing moments, the flickers of forgotten faces and places. If he could reclaim even a piece of that, it would be worth it. He nodded, and with a push, the door creaked open, revealing an inner sanctum bathed in an eerie light that seemed to shimmer and shift, as if the very fabric of time were bending around them. Inside was a vast room, the walls adorned with strange clocks, some ticking, some still, and some moving backwards. It was like nothing Yuan had ever seen before. In the center of the room, sitting on a throne made of glass and stone, was the time merchant. Its figure was cloaked in shadow, the shape difficult to discern, as though the merchant were neither truly here nor not here at all. It was a presence, an essence, more than a being, though its voice, when it spoke, was unmistakably human. You have come, the time merchant said, its voice low and smooth, resonating through the space. I knew you would, eventually. All those who seek to reclaim what they have lost find their way here. Yuan stepped forward, feeling the weight of every moment that had brought him to this point. I want my memories back, he said, his voice steady but laced with desperation. I've lived 1,000 years, but I've forgotten who I am. I want what's mine. The merchant's form shifted in the dim light, its eyes glimmering like distant stars. Ah, yes, it said, almost as if amused. The price of immortality. You thought you could have it all, the endless years, the unending life, but every gift has a price, Yuan. Every century, you gave me a piece of yourself in exchange for time. And now, you want to take it back. Yuan clenched his fists, feeling the familiar burn of frustration rising in him. I never knew. I never asked for this. I didn't know what it would cost me. But you've taken everything, my past, myself. You've stolen it. And now I want it back. The time merchant laughed, a sound that was both hollow and knowing. You think your memories are who you are? They are but fragments, bits and pieces, scattered through time. You are more than your memories, Yuan. But if you wish to try and reclaim them, then I will grant you that chance. But understand this, you cannot simply take them back as if they were objects in a chest. To retrieve your memories, you must offer something in return. Something of equal value. Yuan's heart skipped a beat. He had already given so much, his youth, his love, his past. What more could he give? What was left for him to sacrifice? I'm prepared to pay whatever price, he said, his voice cold, determined. I will give everything. Just return what is mine. The time merchant's form wavered, and for a moment, Yuan thought he saw something like pity in its eyes. Very well, it said, its voice turning almost regretful. You will pay the price, but it will not be what you expect. A strange force rippled through the room, and Yuan felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The clocks on the walls began to spin faster, their ticking growing louder until it was a deafening cacophony, a chorus of time itself. Yuan felt his body grow heavy, his mind growing clouded. His thoughts began to slip away again, his grip on the world faltering. He was losing himself, again. No, he shouted, struggling against the tide of time. I want to remember. I need to remember. The time merchant's voice cut through the chaos, its tone now calm and final. To retrieve your memories, you must become them. You must live through them again, through the pain, the loss, the joy. You must experience them all once more, and only then will they be returned to you in full. Yuan's head spun, and for a moment, he was lost in the whirlpool of his own thoughts. He saw flashes of his past, faces he couldn't name, places he couldn't remember, but they were fleeting, scattered like dust in the wind. He tried to hold on to them, to make sense of them, but they slipped further from his grasp with each passing second. Then, through the fog of his mind, something solid took form. It was a memory. His first love. The girl who had stolen his heart all those centuries ago. Her smile, her laugh, the way her hair had danced in the wind. He could see it so clearly now, as if he were right there, standing beside her, but then, as quickly as it had come, the memory vanished, replaced by another. A different time, a different place. A battle, a war, a life lost in the chaos of conflict. Faces of comrades, each one forgotten until now. The sounds of clashing swords, the heat of the flames, the taste of blood in his mouth. It was too much. Too much to hold on to, too much to relive, and then, another memory. His mother's face, her hands on his shoulders, her voice full of love and warning. She had told him not to go, not to seek the immortality that had promised him everything and nothing. Time is not something you can bargain with, Yuan, she had said, her voice trembling. It will take from you what you cannot give back. The memories came faster now, each one a flash, a spark of emotion, a reminder of everything Yuan had lost. His heart ached as he relived the moments that had shaped him, the moments that had defined him. But each time he tried to hold on, they slipped away, scattering like ashes in the wind. The pain was unbearable. He wanted to scream, to rage against it all. But there was no time. There was no escape. Finally, as the last of his memories faded into the darkness, Yuan realized the truth. The memories weren't what made him who he was. They were pieces of a life that had already passed, fragments that would never return. He couldn't go back, no matter how much he wanted to. What mattered now was what he did with the time he had left. With that realization, the flood of memories ceased. The clocks around him fell silent, their ticking replaced by an eerie stillness. Yuan opened his eyes, gasping for breath, and looked up at the time merchant. It was gone, the room was empty, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Yuan felt something he hadn't felt in centuries. Freedom. Yuan's heart was still pounding, the rhythmic beat reverberating in his chest, as the silence of the room settled around him like a thick fog. The last echoes of the time merchant's voice had dissolved into the ether, leaving behind only the faint hum of forgotten clocks. He stood alone, surrounded by the still, unblinking faces of timepieces that had once held so much power. The walls seemed to close in on him, suffocating him in their oppressive quiet, but beneath the weight, Yuan felt something he hadn't in centuries, a deep, breathless freedom. He was alone. And for the first time in his long existence, he wasn't sure whether it was a blessing or a curse. He took a hesitant step forward, his footfall soft against the stone floor, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The absence of the time merchant's presence was unsettling. The entity that had defined his life for a millennium, the force that had shaped his destiny, was now gone, leaving behind only the void. It was a stark contrast to the presence of that being, that all-knowing force that had once seemed so invincible. And then the truth hit him: he had done it. He had confronted the time merchant, faced its riddle, and endured the endless flood of memories that had nearly drowned him. But more importantly, he had chosen something else. Something that transcended the memories. Something that wasn't tethered to the past or the future. He could feel it now, the remnants of who he was, scattered but still intact. The memories of his past didn't define him anymore. They were pieces, fleeting glimpses of moments long gone, but they weren't the whole of him. He could still feel the joy and pain that had once been his, but they no longer clung to him like chains. He was free of the grip of time, and with that, the world opened up before him, there was no more need for bargains, no more need for endless years. The time merchant had made it clear, time was not a possession to be hoarded. It was a river that flowed endlessly, and no matter how much one tried to dam it, it would always find a way to break free. Yuan closed his eyes, breathing deeply as he let the stillness of the room wash over him. The cool air around him felt different now, lighter, almost as if the burden of eternity had been lifted. For the first time in ages, he felt the weight of his own humanity again, the vulnerability that came with being finite, with being mortal. He had spent centuries chasing immortality, running from death, running from the inevitable. But now, he wasn't afraid. He opened his eyes and looked around the empty room. The walls were lined with clocks, but they no longer held any meaning for him. They had once measured his life, marking the passage of centuries with each tick. Now, they were just clocks, timeless objects, no longer relevant to him. He no longer needed them to remind him that he existed. He was here, in this moment, and that was enough. A soft rustling broke the silence, a sound so faint that Yuan almost missed it. He turned, startled, and found Lian standing in the doorway. She had slipped in without a sound, her presence almost as quiet as the room itself. She was watching him with an expression that was difficult to read, a mix of curiosity and something else, something softer, more understanding. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice as calm and steady as always. Yuan didn't answer immediately. He was still processing everything, still coming to terms with the enormity of what had just happened. He didn't need to explain it to her. He didn't need her to understand. He had done this for himself, not for anyone else. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice a little rough, but steady. "I did." Lian nodded, as if she had expected that answer all along. She stepped into the room fully, her eyes scanning the surroundings with quiet interest. "And now? What happens now?" Yuan thought for a moment. He wasn't sure. The future was still a blank canvas, waiting for him to make his mark. The memories, the fragments of his life, were still there, lingering in his mind, but they no longer felt like chains. They were simply parts of a story, no longer burdening him. He wasn't sure if he could ever truly reclaim the past, nor did he know if he wanted to. But there was something else now, something he hadn't fully appreciated before. "Now," he said, his voice firming as he stood a little straighter, "now I live. I choose to live. Not for immortality, not for endless years, but for this moment. For whatever comes next." Lian studied him, and for the first time since they had met, her face softened. It was a brief flicker, but it was there. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The weight of the silence between them was all the understanding they needed. They were two people, no longer bound by time, standing in a room full of clocks that no longer mattered. Without another word, Lian turned and walked toward the door. Yuan hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. The thought of leaving this place, this strange, timeless room, was unsettling. It had been the center of his quest, the place where everything had changed. But the outside world called to him, as it always had. It was strange, in a way, to think of himself as someone who had a future now, who had a choice. He followed Lian out of the room, stepping back into the city that had once felt so foreign, but now, in his newfound freedom, seemed like a place brimming with possibility. The streets stretched out before him, a canvas for a new beginning. Time was no longer a weight he had to carry. It was a river he could now float on, allowing it to carry him wherever it pleased. As they walked through the city, Yuan found himself listening to the sounds around him, the laughter of children playing, the hum of conversations drifting out from open windows, the distant call of birds in the sky. For a moment, he let the noise wash over him, letting it fill the spaces that had once been filled with the incessant ticking of clocks. He was no longer a man trapped by the weight of immortality. He was free to experience life as it came, without the fear of losing it all. There was no need to hurry, no need to race against the inevitable. The future was his to shape, and he would shape it, not with the weight of 1,000 years behind him, but with the joy of a life that was fully his to live. Lien glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. Perhaps it was the same understanding she had offered him before, or perhaps it was something deeper. Whatever it was, Yuan didn't feel the need to ask. He didn't need answers anymore. The world was unfolding around him, and that was enough. For the first time in centuries, Yuan smiled. It was a simple smile, but it was real. He didn't know what would happen next, or how long his new life would last, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that he was no longer running from time. He was running with it, living in the present, as it should be. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Yuan was truly, deeply alive.